Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. The winner of this month's poll is the next part of my patch by patch coverage for World of Warcraft. We started with the 0.6 beta. Highlights were things such as the exhausted and tired rest states, the new skill system where you spend points on either trait skills, weapon proficiency, or attributes, the addition of guilds, mages having sleep, warlocks getting destroyed by a 30-minute cooldown being added to banish, and the addition of the druid class. I have something special for you in this video though. I can actually show you what the game looked like back then. This is the 0.7 state of the game, and we have quite a few interesting things. Here you can see an actual interface for the skill system. The list itself isn't populated, but this is where you would put in your skill points to your professions or weapon skills and whatnot. Humans actually got a bonus to skill points, as you can see from the character creation. And in the character select screen, you actually got some information about your character's rest state to see if they're worth leveling or not. You can also probably see slight differences in the models and animations. And even the human walk cycle and model are slightly different. It looks very strange if you're used to the retail version. City layouts had minor differences at this point as well. The tram from Stormwind to Ironforge is non-existent, and Ironforge itself saw a layout change in this patch. It used to actually have another level, but players complained that it was too confusing to navigate, so they took it out, putting it much closer to what we all know. Not exact though, as you can see the auction house is a different building entirely, and there are less bridges throughout the city, and so on. The Great Forge was also different just prior to this patch. It was literally a giant forge before it was changed for unknown reasons. Here you can see a wildly different deep run tram. Not a tram at all at this point. It was originally intended that this would lead to the gnome capital, Gnomeregan, but it was never meant to be since the Alliance would have more cities than the Horde, so for balancing reasons, they just tied this to Stormwind instead, and put gnomes in the same starter zone as dwarves, and turned Gnomeregan into a dungeon instead, which explains its massive scale. One of the biggest dungeons in the game at that point, because it was originally going to be a city. Here you can also see the map system was also in development still. Some were finished with that nice parchment style, and others were just that eagle-eye view that you get in your minimap. And here we have dwarf mages, as I promised in the previous video. So it really is a different game. I thought it was more interesting to be able to show you visually what I've been reading in these patch notes. So, what changed this patch? Well, let's take a look. Once again, thanks to the Wowpedia for archiving all of this. I'll have this all linked in the description if you'd like to read it for yourself. The first big thing we have here is the birth of different server types. This patch was the start of player versus player testing. PvP was already in the game. If you attacked the enemy factions, NPCs and whatnot, you'd be attackable by players. What all of this is saying is we're finally getting the PvP server type where, with the exception of low-level zones, you're attackable anywhere. In fact, you can actually find some PvP videos on YouTube still from the pre-launch days where they were focus testing PvP like this, even complete with the select vanilla tracks like Slipknot, Disturbed, and Drowning Pool. Was that one of the unspoken rules for PvP videos back then? It seemed like at least 75% of the videos must have bodies hitting the floor. When Classic re-releases, we should reinstate that rule. So not the true birth of PvP in the game, but it's when they really started testing it and showing players what is best in life, and that's to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of the women. They even teased this crazy system called Battlegrounds, alluding that they'll have some sort of city/town defending aspect to them. The Battlegrounds we know and love only saw a release in the retail version of the game, with the Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley in patch 1.5, and the Arathi Basin in patch 1.7. Remember in the point 6 video when I speculated on how much outrage the new rested system would cause? Well, apparently enough to immediately change it in point 7. They took out the tired and exhausted states, which made you earn a sluggish 50% and 25% XP. Now it's rested at 200%, normal at 150%, and tired at just a normal 100. Much closer to the system that we eventually saw at release, much to the relief of the port beta testers who were grinding boars 12 hours a day. And also, that new skill system saw an immediate change as well. As I mentioned, you gained skill points to spend in either attributes, weapon proficiency, or trade skills. In point 7, attributes were taken out of the pool and instead increased automatically when your character leveled, which was of course what we got with the retail version of the game. You could still get these skill points in this patch, but it would only be for weapons and trade skills now. They didn't say why they changed this, but I imagine it had to do with that balancing issue where people could build dud characters who could cook a meat steak, but get destroyed by level 10 murlocs the entire game. And this patch was also when we first saw the resistance system. Nowadays, something removed a long time ago during the Pandaria expansion, but basically for those who don't know, it's pretty straightforward. You used to have resistances to certain schools of magic, and there were 5 total by release that you could increase, and that's Arcane, Fire, Frost, Nature, and Shadow. In this particular patch, we saw Holy Resistance, which was later replaced with Arcane Resistance instead. You could get it from gear, spells, and even certain races were resistant to certain schools. This would mainly come into play with vanilla raiding. The final boss of the Molten Core, Ragnaros, required quite a bit of fire resistance, or else players would get destroyed in 2 hits. A couple of fights in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj required nature resistance, and in Naxxramas you wanted frost resistance. And it also worked the other way around too. You didn't want to be a fire mage in the Molten Core, because everything was resistant to fire. One of the cool RPG elements in the game back then. Attacking the elemental lord of fire with fire magic isn't gonna turn out too well for you. Anyways, moving on here. This patch was also when we saw those little cinematics were added for each race that sort of set the stage for your character, narrated by the great Earl Bowen.
You must defend the kingdom against the foul mongrels that encroach upon it, and hunt down the subversive traitors who seek to destroy it from within. Now is the time for heroes. Now humanity's greatest chapter can be told.
These original ones would later be replaced at Cataclysm's launch since the world and story changed so much. This patch was also when the mailing system was first introduced, so finally, people had a way of communicating with each other if one of them was offline. This was before the days of Discord and whatnot, so a much needed feature for sure. You could even save copies of letters, like this one I have from 13 years ago from my guild trying to set up a Maraudin run at 3 in the morning. Dang, what a no-life. Another interesting thing to note here is that the level cap was also increased to 45, so nearing the eventual max, which is of course 60. This patch was out on June of 2004, so about 5 months from the release, which is pretty surprising. We're only 3/4 of the way through level testing, and the Hunter class isn't even out yet, but they made it work somehow. And appropriately for the new cap, we saw 3 new zones added, and that's Feralus, Tanarus, and the Hinterlands. All 3 of these pretty important zones, with Tanarus holding Zul'Farrak, and Feralus the mighty Diremaul dungeon, although at this point it was just the zones, no dungeons yet. Speaking of which though, there were 2 more added with this patch. The Nomergon and Alderman dungeons saw the light of day for anyone brave enough to venture inside. Maybe you can say that it's just because we were new to the game back then, but dungeons were so much more imposing back in the day. Today, it's pretty much just walking through a hallway like Final Fantasy XIII. Don't get me started with that bullcorn. But back in the day, they were massive labyrinths with 100 different ways to go. Rare spawn bosses, optional bosses, quests. You needed maps to figure out where the heck you were and where you were going. And I mean actual maps, since dungeon maps weren't in the game yet. Remember the old sunken temple dungeon? Well, Pepperidge Farm remembers. But with more zones comes more traveling, sluggishly walking your way across these ginormous lands. Until now, because this was also when we first saw mounts added to the game. Race-specific mounts are now available. A player can train in any mount. However, the skill points necessary to train for a mount assigned to different races will cost significantly more points. It reminds me of another MMO. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called Star Wars Galaxies, and in this one you also... Wait, what? People are sick of hearing about this already? Well, damn. Never mind, I guess. So, as you can see, even mount training was under the skill point system, which I guess made sense because it was considered a skill back then. It was in the same menu as all of your weapon skills, professions, and weird stuff like languages. Did you know that at some point, undead players could communicate to the Alliance in proximity chat? Well, it makes sense if you think about it, since they used to be humans, of course. People just couldn't be nice to each other in the beta though, especially since this patch was PvP testing, so Blizzard took it away and appropriately named their new language Gutterspeak in punishment for their gutter mouths. So, mail, resistances, mounts, PvP servers, this was a huge patch. So much testing, so little time, with the November 2004 release drawing closer and closer. There were some other big things, such as widescreen support. Remember, this is mid-2004. Most people were still using those old box monitors back then. And AOL. You may remember guilds being added in patch 0.6. These also saw some pretty major updates in this patch. You actually got an interface to see who's online now, and this was also when they added all of the tabard designs so you could create your very own custom emblem. Another little change here is that companion pets were also added in 0.7. It started off innocently enough, just little creatures to accompany you in your adventures. Then, in-game pet battling, and now a mobile clone of Pokemon Go with World of Warcraft pets? What madness is this? There's also quite a large amount of class balancing. Druids in particular saw a lot of action since they were the newest class, being introduced in patch 0.6. Again, I don't cover class balance really, because that would be pretty boring I think. For the most part, it's just cooldown changes and damage tuning. There is one thing worth talking about though. Remember how Warlocks got wrecked by that 30-minute cooldown being added to Banish in the last patch? Well, don't worry, they realized they did go a bit overboard. Kind of a knee-jerk reaction, so they reduced it to a very fair, 20 minutes. Did a Warlock player corpse camp a Blizzard employee or something? What's going on here? But that's about it. There is more. As always, I'll have a link to these notes in the description if you'd like to review them for yourself. I think I hit all of the major highlights though. We have about 5 more pre-release patches to go before we get to the actual release of the game. I hope you're enjoying the series so far. I'm finding it quite fun. It's a learning experience for me as well. I think it's interesting to see just how much the game has changed, especially from these early stages with all of these weird skill systems and whatnot. I'll see you in the next one where we'll cover patch 0.8. Thanks for watching. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.